My grandpa used to work as a stevedore over in Savannah, and he'd tell us all kinds of stories from his time on the job. Like one time, they got a whole shipment of bananas from the Philippines or somewhere, and back in those days they'd transport the bananas still attached to the big old branches that they grew on. They'd pop the crate and then carefully pull the bananas out wearing real thick pairs of gloves, and they wore those gloves because of the tarantulas. The tarantulas didn't eat the bananas, but other, smaller creepy crawlies would, making the banana branches a prime feeding ground for them. Most of the time, the workers over on the other side of the ocean would do their best to get all the bugs off their produce, but every so often, a tarantula would tuck itself away among the bunches after getting its fill of bugs, and then survive the entire transit process from whatever tropical islands that they were from to the ports of the United States. My grandpa said that one time he was working with this guy popping crates of bananas when the guy started to get a little too comfortable. He starts getting slow, talking when he should have been working, and then the next thing, Grandpa's turning around to see this guy's arm deep in a crate, but looking back at Grandpa trying to talk to him and paying no mind to what he was doing. Grandpa said that the second he turned around, he saw this huge, hairy spider just slowly wandering up the guy's arm, biggest thing he'd ever seen during all those years on the job. The guy couldn't feel it because of the big, thick, elbow-length glove that they used to wear to prevent spider bites and whatnot. Grandpa freezes, scared out of his wits, and then just points at the thing crawling up the guy's arm. Only then does the guy actually pay attention to what he's doing. But by then, it was too late. He sees the spider, then lets out this almighty yelp of terror, but this only succeeds in freaking the spider out too. I'm guessing the thing just kind of reacted on instinct and moved to neutralize the threat, so to speak. And still, instead of just jumping off his arm or something, the tarantula runs up the guy's sleeve, then makes this crazy leap right at the guy's face. Grandpa said that the guy's second scream, the one he did when the tarantula hit his face, was just about the loudest and most terrifying noise he'd ever heard. It was like a death scream or something, like the kind of sound a person can only make when they're in fear for their lives. Grandpa said that he did the first thing that came to mind, which was grab something to try and whack the spider off the guy's face. He grabbed a broom and then turned to run back over to his coworker, but saw that he'd already batted the spider off of him and was running for the door of the warehouse. They get outside, slam the door behind them, and Grandpa's checking if the guy is okay when he sees these two big puncture marks on the guy's lower cheek from where the spider had bit him. Again, Grandpa is dumbstruck with fright, and all he can do is quietly point towards where this guy's been bit. I think maybe he just didn't know that he had been bitten, maybe from the adrenaline or what have you, but a moment later, the guy puts a hand to his face and realizes that he's been bitten, and then promptly passes out. Grandpa thought that the guy was dead. He thought the spider's venom had gone straight to the guy's brain and killed him dead in an instant. But then, the same deadly spider is now loose in one of the warehouses, so Grandpa goes running off to warn everyone that his coworker was dead and that there'd be more deaths if they didn't get the hell out of the area. He starts screaming at everyone to run for their lives because some deadly spider just jumped out of a crate and killed the guy he was working with. And this causes a full-blown panic on the docks, with half the guys running to save their skins and the other half organizing impromptu hunting parties so they could track the spider down and kill it. In truth, the guy who had been bitten wasn't dead at all, he just passed out, like I said. But then the area around the bite got so swollen and red so fast that even though the guy woke up and started wandering around, confused, it didn't really do much to calm the situation down. The reality was that even though the bites from the spider were very nasty, they weren't even close to deadly. But since this was like the late 50s or something, there was no Discovery Channel back then, and folks just kind of assumed that every tropical tarantula had a bite that could kill a man stone dead in mere minutes. You had all these stevedores running around with just about any kind of weapon they could get their hands on until finally one of the bosses got wind of what was going on. He shut the place down for the night, called in animal control, and they sent a guy over to find and trap the spider before they took it over to some museum or something for identification. The guy who got bit spent the night in the hospital and then was back at work just a few days later. We always enjoyed hearing that story, but the thing is, that wasn't even the scariest or craziest story my grandpa had from his time as a stevedore. He'd always break the spider story out for the younger crowd at family gatherings, and after miming all the spider stuff with his fingers of one hand, he'd almost always have all the little girls running off in disgust while all the little boys sat around him, completely enraptured by the tale of an encounter with a great hairy monster. But then, after they'd all gone to bed or their parents had taken them home, he'd break out the wilder stories for the adults. Most of these consisted of things like fellas sneaking their girlfriends onto the job with them, then getting caught catching 7 minutes in heaven together in a back office or shipping container, or the time they stole a whole crate of scotch because they realized that there was a mistake on one of the shipping manifests. The right call would have been to simply correct the manifest, but nope. Almost $5,000 worth of luxury scotch went poof and disappeared, and everyone had a very Merry Christmas that year. But then on one occasion, he told us a straight-up horror story. Back during his first year of being a stevedore, my grandpa worked with this guy called Crazy Al. Al was a war veteran, as in he was in the Army during World War II. The guys on the docks knew that he served in the Pacific Islands, and they knew that he'd seen some pretty messed up stuff too, but that was it. No one ever asked Crazy Al about the stuff that he'd seen or where he'd fought because no one wanted to upset him, and no one wanted to upset him because, like I said, he's Crazy Al. My grandpa said everyone felt for the guy, but that he wasn't particularly popular neither, on account of him being almost impossible to work with. Crazy Al couldn't be around loud noises, and woe-betide anyone who accidentally startled him, so instead of working the warehouses and whatnot like the rest of the workers, Grandpa said Crazy Al was kept in the equipment room, where folks went to get tools, slings, safety gear, and things of that nature. You just didn't walk in either. You knocked really softly on the door till Al came to ask you what you wanted, and that way, he was kept at a safe distance from everyone else. Anyway, one day the docks get this big old cargo ship coming in, only right away they can tell something is different about it, because some of the containers had different kinds of letters on them. It turns out, the ship had come all the way from South Korea, and since the country was rebuilding from the war at that time, I figured this was one of the first Korean ships to dock in America for quite a while. So the ship docks, and these two Korean officers walked down the gangplank to greet the foreman in perfect English. They exchanged a few words, discussed the unloading of their ship, then off they went back to their quarters while the stevedores got to work. Sometime later, Crazy Al comes out of the equipment shed for some reason. Someone later said that they saw him walk out, and when he saw the ship floating in the dock, he just stopped and stared at it, like he was hypnotized or something. According to my grandpa, this person mentioned Crazy Al's episode to one of his coworkers, but since Al had more than earned his nickname by that point, it was kind of like, what else is new? And so the last people saw of Al, he was marching across the dock with a crowbar in hand, heading straight for the gangplank of the Korean ship. Then the next thing, everyone on the dock started to hear screaming coming from it. And there are screams and shouts all in Korean, and from the sounds of things, it was like they were having some kind of fight up there. Then the next thing, gunshots. And so everyone scatters and the cops get called. Everyone's still sort of hiding out, keeping an eye on the ship when the cops show up and run aboard with their guns drawn. And there, they find Crazy Al, shot to death with a crowbar in his hand. Then in the vicinity were 2 dead Koreans beat to death by Al and about half a dozen wounded Korean soldiers, one of which had shot Crazy Al dead with a gun that they kept on board for emergencies. For years, everyone kind of figured that Al had mistaken the Koreans for Japanese, which is obviously one of the two countries we were at war with while Al was serving as a soldier. But the truth is much more disturbing. You see, as it turned out, Al had been a prisoner in a Japanese POW camp, a particularly brutal one too. He'd seen his fellow soldiers tortured, executed, and slowly worked to death over the course of 2 to 3 years. He learned to hate the camp's guards, but not all of them were Japanese. Part of Japan's conquest of Asia included the Korean peninsula, and they gave a lot of Koreans a chance to prove their loyalty to their new masters by serving as guards in their prisoner of war camps. Then, to prove just how fanatically loyal they really were, they treated American POWs way crueler than the Japanese did, as a way of winning over their new masters. And Crazy Al probably had his very own Korean camp guard, and I'm not saying it could possibly excuse what he did to those poor sailors, but it certainly explains why he turned so murderous just at the sight of them. The thing is, folks just carried on thinking Al was crazy. Couldn't tell the difference between Korean and Japanese, they'd say. Stupid old Crazy Al, crazier than a poop house rat. But then, it seems to me and my grandpa that Al wasn't all that crazy after all. Sure, he was disturbed, but there's a chilling kind of clarity to him choosing to take vengeance like that. The way my grandpa tells it, he was just quiet. He didn't run across the docks, screaming and cursing, waving his crowbar around. He just walked, all cool and calm, to try and commit a massacre without saying a word. And that little detail never fails to creep me out.
Hey guys, thanks so much for all the support. If you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, please feel free to do so. My father used to work with MNC, and he is often out on trips overseas, and it just gets easier for me to fool around since me and my father are the only ones at home. So once he is gone, I get the home to myself for months. I used to accompany him when I was a kid, but then I stopped once I was 14. Now that I was 18, I had much more freedom and everything was easy. We were pretty rich, so it wasn't like we had hard times or something like that. It was a very easy breeze for me, and I was enjoying my time being on my own. I would call my friends and we would hang out till the late sometimes, playing video games or just hanging out with girls from back in school. We were having the time of our life, and it was amazing to just be all on my own. And then one day, out of nowhere, comes my father with this woman. She was gorgeous, and probably had some work done on her with the looks of it. At first, I thought that maybe she is just a guest and will leave soon with Dad, but as Dad packed up for his next trip, Miss Osaka just stood there saying goodbye, and there was this immediate disappointment that I felt. It looked like my freedom was vanishing right in front of my eyes, and there was nothing I can do. The friends, seems like I can't invite them over anytime soon now. I was pissed. I was really very angry. She just stopped me from being cool as she was present. First month, she was much more warmer, but as we grew close, she started being a colossal stuck-up cow and stopped me from having fun at all. She would sit at the front room and stop me from going outside. And first, I thought it was just some naive cultural thing. But sooner, she would be aggressive and stop me from moving at all. Her soon not-so-scary-looking actions became hostile as her stays became frequent. She would go on with the father sometimes, but sometimes she would just stay and make my life a living hell. And then the day came when she married my father and made my life officially a hell. And then I had to make a decision that I have to leave the house and move out in my own place. I told my father the plan. At first he agreed and decided that he will help me out. And then later, upon discussing with my stepmother, he refused. Stepmother won't let me out. She wanted me to stay with her. She was trying to control everything from the finances to all of us. I was adamant, and I did the move out all by myself. And then I was coming back to get my old stuff, when she got closer and bashed my head. And then I woke up and saw myself tied to the chair. I was surprised, angry, and in shock all at the same time. I screamed, and then told her that she had gone completely crazy, and then she just shouted at me, "I need my family close." I mean, having a caring stepmother would have been good, but a crazy obsessive stepmother who won't let me leave. She kept me tied there for around 3 days and would feed me with her own hands, and she was completely a psycho mother. And then a week later, I woke up to see my dad tied too. I jokingly said, "Welcome to the party," and then he just instantly regretted every moment with that psycho. I knew what she wanted, and then I said, "Let's have a family dinner with Mom." And as I said, she just started crying and then hugged me and untied me and my father and said, all I wanted was to be a family and be loved. And as she did that, I couldn't help but feel bad for her and probably all the trauma that she must have gone through. But still, she was a psycho. So I tackled her and pinned her to the floor, called the police, and did everything to get her arrested. Took us months to move on. My father just won't date a woman anymore, and I guess it is for the better for me and for him. I did eventually move out in case he decided to do that all once again. Two summers ago, I met a girl on that dating app Bumble. I previously tried my hand at Tinder and Plenty of Fish, but I found that anyone I'd reached out to or matched with was less than reluctant to take our conversations offline. That's when I heard about Bumble. Now, for those of you that don't know, Bumble is the dating app where women make the first move. I'm guessing that makes them feel more comfortable and in control of any particular correspondence. So I figured I'd increase the chances of finding someone that actually liked me enough to want to talk. At first, it proved to be no different than any other dating app. And I hate to break it to any guys thinking of trying it, but it's more than often the same old story of match and don't talk. However, like most things, persistence is key. And in the end, I ended up matching with a girl who seemed genuinely interested in me. I don't really want to use her name, so we'll just call her Danielle for the sake of ease. And given the embarrassing nature of the story, I won't be telling you much about me either. Danielle was really nice at first. We definitely were into the same sort of things, but that was fine. She had this infectious passion for things she was into, and that made me want to learn more. And of the things that she was into in a big way was Japanese anime. I don't think I'd watched the cartoons when South Park first came out, and I know it makes me sound a bit dull, but subtitled films just aren't my thing. But the thing that I did find compelling was some of the artwork. Like, I remember she was into a series called, and please forgive me if I get it wrong, Attack on Titan. From what I could gather was basically just a war between giants and regular humans, but the scale at which some of the art is drawn, it really makes for some compelling viewing. So me and Danielle went on a couple of dates, and after the 4th time, we'd met up for food. She asked me if I wanted to go back to her place. Of course I said yes, and within an hour or so, we were making out on her couch with some Netflix documentary providing a little background noise. Things got gradually steamier and steamier, until suddenly she jumped up off the couch, excused herself, and then disappeared into the bedroom. I thought she might be going to get some rubber or something more on an oil change into something a bit comfier, but instead, she reappeared with her laptop under her arm, telling me she wanted to show me something. I had my suspicions about what it was, as she'd hinted at certain lewd interests of hers. Her choice of words, not me. But when she actually showed me, well, it was something else. They were all pictures drawn in that same anime art style, but they were all of the girls in states of semi-undress. Unusual. Yeah, but I'm not going to lie to you and say it wasn't unappealing. I mean, it was quite the opposite. It was magnetic. Some of the girls had a certain feline aesthetic to them, which both myself and Danielle found very attractive. She added that it was the exact aesthetic she wanted to replicate. It was just a case of finding the right guy to try it with. I think I must have blushed so hard that I had closely resembled a tomato. Because obviously the implications here was that this guy she wanted to try things with, that guy was me. I'd only ever had very vanilla relationships before then, so the prospect of trying something new was beyond exciting for me.
Anyway, we continued to cuddle for a bit, and then when we were sufficiently pooped, she invited me to sleep in her bed with her for sleeps, nothing more, but I was okay with that. But then, at the risk of sounding a bit weird, we didn't exactly finish our little makeout session, if you catch my drift. So I was left with a rather distinct urge, the kind that if it went unanswered would end up in causing a distinctly blue kind of discomfort. And for those who have empathy and not just sympathy, I'm sure you know just how painful it can be. The last thing I wanted to do was wake Danielle up by doing that next to her sleeping body. So I quickly got up, went into her TV, Roman opened her laptop. I knew her password was just mince the name of the gerbil she had recently lost, so I plugged that in and found the folder with all the lewd pictures she showed me. It turned out that the collection she'd showcased just hours before had been but the tip of the iceberg. Danielle must have saved literally thousands of those pictures, and it's sorted into a variety of subgenres, shall we call them. Some of them were definitely up my street, others not so much. And in the end, I found myself perusing the different kinds of material instead of focusing on the task at hand. It's then that I noticed that that particular folder seemed hidden within another. All of the folders tended to be called things that sounded like Japanese words, which I'm guessing were the codes or direct names for whatever they contained. But one was labeled with nothing but a few punctuation marks. And unlike the others, where a few preview images gave you an idea of what the folder contained, this one had nothing of the sort. At first, I was a bit reluctant to click on it. Then turned out to be the pictures of Danielle in a state of undress. I'd be mortified. Seeing something like that would feel like peeking behind the curtain when it wasn't the right time. Like I was pent up, but not that pent up. It's still, my curiosity got the better of me. I decided I'd double click, take a peek, and if it was anything remotely human looking, I just close the folder and move on. I was way more nervous than I should have been. But in the end, I double-clicked and took a peek from out the corner of my eye. What I see still doesn't contain any actual real human beings to my infinite relief. But instead, I saw things that gave me a whole new reason to wish I hadn't opened that mystery folder up to my initial relief. All I saw was more animated stuff, but on closer inspection, this stuff was much more different than the other things I'd seen. The first thing was a GIF in which a girl is going down on the guy. Pretty hard stuff. So I settled in to enjoy it if you catch my meaning. Only the moment I get comfortable, the guy in the animation pulls out a gun of all things and puts it to the girl's forehead. I had no idea she was into this weird non-consensual stuff for being scared while being intimate, but it was honestly really shocking. But then it got so much worse. I actually gasped when the guy pulled the trigger, and the amount of cartoon gore that came out of the exit wound was absolutely horrific. Then, instead of ending the horrid little affair, the guy carries it on. He keeps, and God, I don't even know if this is the right word, but using her all I could do was watch an absolute horror as both he and the GIF finished. And the whole thing began to loop again. A rush to close it before it could be, then I just leaned back into the couch, kind of shaken at what I had just seen. I've never been the squeamish type, so that wasn't really the issue. And neither am I a kind of prude. But can you blame me for reacting that way? I've never seen anything so horrendously violent in my entire life. But at the same time, I couldn't believe what I was seeing. It was literally mind-blowing that someone out there had put the time and effort into creating something so utterly repulsive. It was like walking past a car accident at the side of the road. And he knows you shouldn't look and you almost don't want to, but at the same time, you can't help yourself. The next thing I clicked on was a still image, but somehow it was even worse than the first I'd seen. It was like a before and after picture and including the girl in some kind of restraining device similar to medieval stocks. Only instead of being held in that bent over way you'd imagine the girl was being held in, a way that her head and her hindquarters were protruding from the same side of the device. In the first picture, the girl was almost expressionless, no damage on her. The second picture, however, totally different. The girl is most definitely deceased. She's missing appendages, and most of the things that should be inside her are very much on display through various gashes and slashes. Again, the detail was absolutely painstaking. Someone must have put hours upon hours of work into such a thing, staring continuously at something that was literally nightmare-inducing. And there were thousands of those things. Some including things like giant insects or cannibalism, all tucked away in some nameless folder. Presumably, it was difficult to find things online, and that's why she had to save them to her hard drive. But there was definitely a moment when I figured she might be actually making them herself. So by that point, I'm thoroughly creeped out. I kind of want to confront Danielle on what I've seen, but at the same time, I know I'm being a bit judgmental. She had warned me that she was into some less than conventional things, and I'd found the idea of that to be attractive. But that weird, ultra-violent level of weird, I don't know if I could handle that. I came to the conclusion that I bring it up to her at some point, make it clear that her more violent tastes weren't something that I shared. Then we could just sort of go on like I hadn't seen it. I mean, I used to play at GTA Vice City back in the day. I loved it too, but it didn't mean that I went on a mass murder cocaine dealer did. Besides, the last thing I wanted to come across was some handcuffed clutching prude, and there was more to it than just artwork because before it closed the folder and shut her laptop, I scrolled right to the bottom of the folder to take in just how much content was there. And that's when I saw another folder with a similar elite gibberish label. Inside was what I initially thought was more animation. Each file was a video, and since I can only see red lights and dark backdrop, I figured it'd be another disturbingly artistic depiction of an execution, or at least something to that effect. But as I opened up the video, I instantly realized that it wasn't any kind of animation. It was an execution that much I'd guessed correctly, but it was real. In fact, every single video in there depicted a murder or accidental death, the former being the heavy majority. Accompanying the video was a text file. One seemed to feature a commentary on each of the videos. I couldn't tell if Danielle was the author of it or not, but even then it made for some extremely disturbing reading. One tract of the text explained how the author actually envied one of the video's victims, adding having a look at post-mortem tranquility in their eyes was something they wanted to experience themselves. I don't even want to begin to unpack how wrong and disturbing of an idea that is. Not right now anyway. But what was even creepier were the strong central overtones that seemed to drift from this person's writing. They were getting off from what they were seeing. It was as simple as that. They weren't just getting off to the idea of dying either. They were getting off on the idea of being the one doing the killing too. I had to remind myself that finding this kind of material on anyone's computer would make for a horrendous discovery, but finding it in the same space as more suggested material, God, that made it extra terrifying in my mind. I gathered up my things, got dressed, went home. There I deleted all of Danielle's contact details, blocked her various accounts, binges, chunked the whole thing up as a loss. I have to admit to getting a little bit attached to her over the 5 or 6 weeks we were dating, and it really felt grim that I was severing all ties with her. But what else could I do? Start a relationship with someone who secretly harbored violent erotic fantasies, going to get married and have some kids with someone who was quite evidently excited by some of the most horrific images I've ever likely to see. I understand that someone isn't strictly neurotypical, as they say on Twitter these days, but I'm certainly not about to start a life with them or create life with them either. Not when they have a very distinct interest in snuffing it out.
When my Nana was very young, she was fortunate enough to have been able to meet her great-grandmother. The women in our typically Irish family tend to have their children at a young age, so it's not unusual for one of the older members of our clan to be able to meet their great-grandchildren before they shuffle off their mortal coil. Now, her great-grandmother, my great-great-grandmother, always wore black. She was a scathing but witty old dear, and if she didn't like you, she would say things like, "May the cat eat you and the devil eat the cat." She was also a widow, lost her husband early on in their marriage, and stuck to her vow of perpetual mourning. The experience made her a deeply religious woman, too. I mean, every Irish person has a little of the church in them anyway, but she took her faith very, very seriously after losing her husband, and I think a lot of that is down to the circumstances in which she lost him. You see, my great-great-grandfather was a sailor in the Royal Navy, which wasn't unheard of back then since we were still subjects of the British Empire, and the ship he sailed on was named the HMS Wasp. Early one morning in the year of 1884, the crew of the HMS Wasp were given the task of ferrying a gang of bailiffs and police to this place called Inistrahall, a little island off the coast of Donegal. The police had nasty business to attend to, as on the island, 3 poor families were no longer able to pay rent to the landowner and were due to be kicked out of their houses. When the sailors found out that they were abetting such cruelty, their hearts sank. The HMS Wasp has visited them previously, delivering a few sacks of potatoes when the islands were on the verge of starvation. They knew how hard life was for the poor islanders, who somehow eked out an existence on a rock that's less than half a square mile in size. The way my Nana tells it, it was so early in the morning that the sun hadn't yet risen, but the crew of the Wasp had sailed those waters many times before, and the veil of darkness was no hindrance to them. Yet somehow, the ship managed to collide with some rocks just off of a place called Tory Island. The ship went down fast, with only 6 of the boat's passengers and crew surviving the freezing cold waters. 52 sailors, policemen, and bailiffs drowned that morning, with my great-great-grandfather being one of them. The incident was a huge scandal, and mainly because it emerged that the HMS Wasp had sunk directly within sight of a lighthouse. This meant that, by all accounts, they should have been well aware of their positioning in relation to rocks they knew well were there. So, as you can imagine, a great deal of rumor and mystery shrouded the ship's sinking, and one particular explanation seemed to capture the imaginations of the mainlanders. It was said that the folk who lived on Inistrahall Island had long been isolated from the Irish mainland and viewed mainlanders with contempt and suspicion. Hundreds of years before, Christianity had been slow to make its way over to Inistrahall, and legend speaks of a massacre that occurred there after many of the islanders refused to renounce their old gods. People said that there was still some who lived on the island that worshipped pagan deities, invoking ancient curses and performing blood sacrifices. So, when a ghastly theory emerged that the islanders had used a kind of cursing stone known as a cloc terre to sink the Wasp before it could land bailiffs on the island, people actually believed it. What's worse is that the story then tells of a local priest who heard of such ungodly practices and sailed to Inistrahall. There he located the cloc terre and promptly hurled it into the ocean to cleanse the taint of paganism from the island. The same priest then safely made it back to the mainland where, by some horrible twist of fate, slipped and fell on a walkway one day and drowned in the River Finn. People were absolutely convinced it was the curse of the cloc terre, and my great-great-grandmother was one of them. Until the day she died, she believed something unholy had risen up from the ocean to take her husband away from her. Now obviously I know that's just a silly old story my family tells, despite all my aunties swearing it's the God-honest truth. And I know because I actually did some research into the sinking of the HMS Wasp, but that didn't make what I found any less horrifying. The Royal Navy held an inquiry into the incident and were looking to court-martial the surviving sailors for negligence. Only one of the survivors had been on deck at the time of collision, and this man swore that the lights of the Tory lighthouse went dark not long before they hit the rocks. Since it was a routine journey for the crew, a junior officer was placed at the helm to gain some experience, but was so lacking in that department that he was unable to navigate in the dark, hence the ship hitting those rocks. To me, the idea of the lighthouse going dark is much more feasible than any cursing stone or what have you. But that means that the people of Tory Island colluded with the people of Inistrahall to plunge the ship carrying their tormentors into darkness, The islanders killed 52 men that morning, all to avoid being evicted from their homes. Whether or not you can blame them is another question entirely, and given that I actually lost a relative in the incident, I don't think I can give you an unbiased answer. But the fact remains that 52 people found themselves plunging into the icy waters of the Atlantic Ocean on a freezing winter's morning in complete darkness. Imagine the horror of slowly hearing the cries of your shipmates gradually falling silent until you yourself are taken by hypothermia. You certainly don't need a belief in the supernatural for that tale to give you the shivers.